All right. We're here with CJ from Dangerous History Podcast. What's going on, buddy?
Hey, very happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, no doubt, man. I want to say I was listening to you a lot when I was driving over the road, and then I guess I just kind of you kind of fell out of my routine because a lot of different podcasts fell out of my routine once I started driving locally in 2021. And we were chatting the other night and you was like, yeah, I just released another podcast. And I was like, oh, I need to go check out your newest stuff. And I listened to it and you brought up Bechtel or Bechtel. How do you say it?
I think it's Bechtel. Yeah.
Bechtel. Yeah, you brought them up and I was like, oh man, this is right in my lane. I love like these types of conversations and subjects. So I figured I'd have you on and we could talk about it. So how did you stumble across Bechtel?
Well, I've been for like, I don't even know, 15 years, if not more. I've been really interested in the kind of like shady, dark world where intelligent and certain corporations and also certain private sector organized crime overlap. Like I've always been interested, when you find instances of the CIA teaming up with the mafia someplace or working with, opium growers in Southeast Asia or the drug kingpins in South America. And the same deal, there's like this whole little world which I think it's Alfred McCoy, the great historian of a lot of this stuff, calls it the covert netherworld, and I love that dramatic language. But it's just these interesting shady characters. Very often, the central characters are these like liminal guys with one foot in
Mm,
each world who have gone through the revolving door a few times. Some guy that's worked in government and then gone and worked at a company like Bechtel or maybe a big corporate law firm or something like that. Older versions of this would be someone like Alan Dulles or really both Dulles brothers.
right.
Um, so I've in reading up on that stuff and podcasting about a lot of that stuff for years and whatever. I've bumped into the name Bechtel in various places, and I kind of vaguely knew it was a powerful, important corporation that was big on like building oil pipelines and things like that. And definitely seemed to be deep state connected. But when I bumped into Bechtel in reference to the youth center where Kamala Harris spent so many nights on her childhood, I was like, you know what? That's that's fishy because I already had been led to believe that this youth center might have had some sort of covert CIA funding. And then to find out that the lady who was running it back in the 70s, her husband was a Bechtel engineer. That was just one of those little red flags, from years of researching this stuff where I was like, you know what? I need to really try to find out a bit more about Bechtel because I know they're one of those fishy, deep state connected corporations, but I don't know a lot of details. And I think Bechtel as a company has for most of its history like gone out of its way to sort of like a Kaiser Soze move or whatever. Like the greatest trick is people not knowing you exist or really not knowing what you're up to. I
Mm,
always talk about like the owners of this country, and there's a few owners of this country in the American system that are names people recognize, names like Rockefeller or more recent people like Bill Gates or people like that. But the majority of the people who really constitute the owners of this country and this system are just like not household names, and the Bechtel family is a good example of that. And there's others that are even more obscure than that. But yeah, so I dug in and said, you know what, I'm gonna try and figure out a bit more about Bechtel, and I found this really cool book that's I think long since out of print and a little bit hard to find, but you can find used copies of it for a reasonable price. It's called Friends in High Places, written by a real journalist back in the 80s. And the context of that is the Bechtel Corporation was all over the Reagan administration, and they had been pretty well plugged into the Nixon administration before that. So anyway, I started to dig into the history of this company and what it really was and where it came from, and I found out, holy crap, it's way more wild and interesting than I thought. That it's Yeah. I mean, it's just an interesting like rise of a family dynasty in a lot of ways. And some aspects of their story are kind of admirable. I mean, they did build some useful things here and there, and they're not all bad, like every single thing they do. But for sure, a lot of the stuff they've been plugged into, especially since World War II, has been, connected to intelligence and to the State Department and US foreign policy. So they're very much a political entity.
Did you say you started you like to dive into the CIA, which is something I like to dive into as well. Um,
Mhm.
and One of the things I found that shocked me most whenever I first started diving in was the majority of the CIA operatives that we hear about that make big names for themselves, like Alan Dulles. Um, we they're bankers or from the corporate world. They're not from military world at all. And I like going
Mhm.
into researching it, I would have thought I would have ran into a lot more military intelligence people,
Mhm.
but these guys are all corporate. And I think it was when I read Confessions of an Economic Hitman where it all started tying together and I started understanding the way that they compartmentalize these different brackets.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great and very interesting book, and definitely, Bechtel um, is one of those type of companies, where they'll go into, uh, you know, build I don't know, a highway system in some third world country, and then, should that government have trouble paying its bills, well, they might call in, the jackals to get a
Mm,
new government if it comes to that.
right.
Um, but yeah, it's interesting with the CIA. Yeah, relatively few high level people at least have a military background. Yeah, a lot of them have a corporate background, like a corporate lawyer, like the
Yeah.
Dulles brothers, people like that. And just in general, whether they had a previous career in the private sector or even if they were recruited, fresh out of college, it's amazing. This definitely was true of the early CIA, and as far as I can tell, it's still mostly true today, where they recruit people very heavily from like the Ivy League universities. And, especially the sorts of people they recruit who they sort of recruit intending to groom them for leadership positions. It's always been this kind of like, disproportionately recruiting from the Ivy League. And then even within that, disproportionately tending to recruit from all those sketchy secret fraternities and things, right? Skull and Bones is the most famous, but
Right. Yeah.
there's a bunch of other ones too at all the Ivy League schools. And yeah, I mean, when you see like, was it Kermit Roosevelt Jr. was like a top CIA field operative and one of the main guys behind. Uh, and then, finishes up doing that regime change operation. And then, wouldn't you know it, one of the oil companies on whose behalf I forget which one it was, but one of the oil companies that benefited greatly from, overthrowing Mohammed Mossadegh's democratic government there um, gave Kermit Roosevelt Jr. A high-paying corporate job. He, retired from the CIA soon after. So yeah, there's a lot of that revolving door stuff for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. It's real interesting stuff when you start digging into it. I have I can't remember the guy's name. They wrote I have a book about him. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was it's kind of like this hippie guy who was a scientist who ended up being like really like high level in during the MK Ultra era, running a bunch of experiments. And
Mm.
then then he retired and he went back and lived on a beach and was surfing with his wife. And it was just like this kind of it's just kind of these obscure characters you run into when you start digging into the CIA. Like and the type of people that it attracts and that they recruit. It gets really weird at times.
Yeah, it's very complicated. I basically it seems like one of the things that they look for when they're recruiting, especially someone who, like I was saying, they kind of are intending to groom for eventual leadership. It seems pretty clear that, and for obvious reasons, they want someone with very high intelligence, but they don't want someone with a very like strong, independent code of ethics or morality or anything like that. Like they
Or
want to
like
try and find someone
low
that,
on empathy.
go ahead.
Like they want somebody low
Yeah.
on empathy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's pretty
Yeah.
wild
Yeah.
when you
Someone
start
who's,
digging in.
basically a psychopath.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody who is a psychopath. I don't think they want sociopaths because sociopaths are, more impulsive and harder to kind of control and harder to predict. But I think they like a nice, like, calm, cold, rational psychopath. Because that's the kind of person that, like, if you tell them, oh, we need to, plant this bomb in the middle of a market in some third world country or whatever it might be, they're not likely to ask a lot of questions. They're not likely to be like, well, wait a minute, aren't there going to be a bunch of just random innocent people shopping there when the bomb blows up? Or, or hey, go murder, the president of the Congo, the first democratic leader they've ever had in their history as a country. You want someone who's going to be like, yes, sir. You don't want someone who's going to sit there asking questions like, is this really necessary? Is this a good idea? Might it lead to civil war if we do this? Like, you don't want someone who's going to be troubled by all those sorts of like normal human impulses and things.
So so with Bechtel, what I find found interesting about the way you were describing the way that Bechtel operated, um, was that they were very engaged within the community structures uh, in California. Did you
Mhm.
find that in other places too? I know you said you've been doing some research and you're planning on doing a full podcast on them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think the title of this book that I've been reading about Bechtel is a very apt one, Friends in High Places, because it the company like started and began to become successful because they really did a good job like building things. They actually would like get it done on time and at or under budget and whatever. That hasn't always been the case, going forward. But in their early days, like they really got a reputation for, being kind of hard nosed or whatever. But like, they'll get it done. And they built some things like the Hoover Dam. They were one of the main companies involved in that. That we could argue about whether it was best to do that or not, or whether the government was the best, means to do that. But like it at least served a purpose. It wasn't like a nuclear bomb or something.
Mm,
But as they got more and more kind of plugged into being political entrepreneurs, they they kind of switched their strategy more and more. And this came from the top down, from the guy who first started the company was Warren Bechtel. He actually started like literally with mules, creating beds for railroad companies around the turn of the last century. And then the next patriarch of the family was Stephen Bechtel Sr. And then the next one after that was Stephen Bechtel Jr. And then I think there have been at least two more heads of the family, like generations, since then, to the current CEO. And it seems like with each generation of the honcho, more and more it's it's like about politics, at least as far as a lot of the big deals go. I mean, Bechtel's involved in all kinds of building projects. Many of them are, kind of mundane
hmm
things abroad, but they also build like if the king of Saudi Arabia wants a new highway system or the king of Saudi Arabia wants to build a new oil pipeline, there's a damn good chance that Bechtel is going to be involved in that. And so, yeah, they've really been very effective at the strategy of just schmoozing. Like they're really good at it. And it's like a conscious, deliberate thing too. I think I don't think it's just an unconscious, instinctive thing. Like they deliberately try to cultivate friendly relationships with important people, and you can see them doing that. Um, when Stephen Bechtel Sr. sort of became buddies with Alan Dulles, for example. Um, just saw it would be to my benefit. Yeah, this guy is a rising star at the CIA, probably is going to be running it soon. You know what? I do a lot of stuff abroad, especially in the Middle East. You know who'd be a great guy to be good personal buddies with? This guy.
mm,
They're very good at that, and they are very savvy. A lot of time, not always, but a lot of times in operating in the Middle East too, they seem to be pretty good at like figuring out how to buddy up to like Middle Eastern sheikhs and princes and whatever like that. So yeah, they are good at that. And Bohemian Grove, which I mentioned a bit in that episode, Bohemian Grove is just a great example of that. I mean, it's a gathering every summer of like some of the most wealthy and powerful people in the US, and often various guests from abroad. I mean, very often there'll be like current, or not current, but former and future presidents walking around there. And
Mhm.
back in the 60s, 70s, like Stephen Bechtel would be there. He was part of, they have different lodges at Bohemian Grove with different names, and like some are considered more, elite than others. And the Bechtels are at Mandalay, which is like, the fancy one. I think it's considered like the most prestigious lodge to be a part of there or whatever.
Mhm.
And that they would have like, Henry Kissinger would be there, George Shultz would be there, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Sometimes Richard Nixon might be there, Ronald Reagan might be there, as well as like, a whole bunch of former and future heads of the CIA, secretaries of state, and a whole bunch of like corporate tycoons and whatever. And yeah, very good at just like just buddying up to people and insinuating their way into different they do what a lot of these sorts of families do, where they do a lot of philanthropic activity, but you quickly get the sense it's not so much out of genuine altruism. It's a strategy. It's partly a PR strategy, and it's also partly a, hey, if you're part of the elite, that's one of the places that you make friends and rub elbows. You do it by serving
Mhm.
on each other's boards of directors, but you also do it by serving, on the board of like some big prestigious charity or whatever like that. And there's a lot of that going on for sure. Um, Interestingly, I just found out very recently, as most of my research on Bechtel so far has been up until like the 1980s, but I was looking a little bit at more recent stuff, and I found out that I want to say 2016 or 2017, they moved their company headquarters. Their company headquarters had been in San Francisco for close to a century, and they 6, 7, 8 years ago, something like that, they relocated, made their company headquarters Reston, Virginia, which if anybody knows, anyone listening knows the geography of Virginia, Reston, Virginia is Northern Virginia. It's like one of the main DC kind of
Mhm.
suburb satellite towns there in Northern Virginia. And to me, that's very revealing that after having had, that they kind of built their company in California. They've always been associated with California. They've been members of Bohemian Grove for generations. They've been in San Francisco for generations. Um, but they relocated their HQ to, one of the fancy DC suburbs. Like,
Mm.
I don't
Yeah,
know. To
that
me,
is
that says
interesting.
something.
Do they have a I know you find a lot with these companies when you start digging into them, you'll find like little satellites here and there. Do they have a
Hmm.
lot of little like shoot offs that are doing government contracts under different names, maybe to like to launder money back to them, hide where the funds are going?
Yeah, there's a lot of that stuff. I mean, just reading their history, it's kind of hard to keep track of sometimes because yeah, they'll start up like an offshoot company to do like one particular thing for a while, but then, they might close it down eventually when that opportunity runs dry or runs out. Like during during World War II, Bechtel got into shipbuilding, building ships for the US government during the war. And that was something they had like no previous history doing. And if I remember right, the details was just, the that Stephen Bechtel senior or junior, I think it was senior still, yeah, at the time during World War II. He just happened to become like get introduced to and start chumming it up with the guy like in charge of the US government ship procurement, stuff.
Mm.
And just like, oh yeah, there's this huge opportunity. Like if you build ships, you get a contract for $1 zillion. And he's just like, all right, I'll do it. And so set up a boat building company subsidiary. I don't recall off the top of my head what it was called, but like you know, they did build a bunch of ships for the government. As far as I know, they were, decent. I haven't found anything about them being, defective like Smedley Butler talks about
Right.
in War as a Racket. But, things like that, they'll set up things, and they'll also often partner with other companies. So like one thing that they've done a lot is they'll build things like refineries and pipelines. They won't actually run them. They're not an oil company. But like if, Standard Oil of California, which they were very close to for a long time, if Standard Oil of California wants to build a big new refinery or a pipeline or whatever like that, they'll, you know, basically contract Bechtel. Bechtel will actually build it, and then the oil company will run it.
Mm.
And sometimes on really big projects, they'll team up with other building, and logistics and engineering type
Like
companies. So like,
KBR and
uh, yeah, yeah. And I forget off the top of my head, the Hoover Dam, they were like one of the main companies behind the Hoover Dam, but it was a partnership of, I want to say, six or seven actual companies to do that, and that was a huge job. And just from like a interesting story point of view, I had no idea. Like I knew building the Hoover Dam was a big project and a tough job and, dangerous and whatever for the guys that actually were out there doing the labor, but holy
mm,
cow, it's way worse than I ever would have thought in terms of like the rates of death and injury and like the conditions. I've personally never been to the Hoover Dam, so I've never seen it firsthand, but you read about like the brutal heat in the summer. Guys are just dropping like flies. Um, and yeah, so yeah, I mean that was a multi-company thing. But yeah, there's like different they sort of will subtly change their name and have different companies. And it's often kind of complicated, especially for someone like me. Like I don't come from a corporate lawyering background or anything like that,
yeah.
so it's often hard for me to even just keep track of it because it'll be like over here they're talking about the Bechtel group, and then over here they're talking about the Bechtel Corporation. And it's like, okay, what exactly is the difference? What exactly is the relationship of these two things, And yeah, I think it's partly just like that's how business is when you're at that level with that much, money and resources and employees and whatever. It kind of naturally turns that way. But yeah, there's also the level of, well, if you make it more complicated and you periodically change a few, names, and no, this corporation we disbanded and then we set up this other one, and might have Bechtel in the title, might not. Yeah, it just kind of makes it a little bit like muddies the waters for the casual person, in the same way that like United Fruit Company, um, which was involved in so much nasty stuff in Latin America, they eventually just are like, oh, we'll call ourselves Chiquita, and
Mm.
that'll sound, somehow more benevolent and throw people off a little bit. Or the way that Anglo-Iranian oil became British Petroleum, right?
Yeah.
This is how they keep it like you don't realize that, like, oh yeah, BP that had that giant oil spill in the Gulf years ago. Oh yeah, they're the same company that was behind overthrowing the democratically elected government of Iran back in the 50s,
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to do a little bit of Googling or read a book or two to figure out that.
Right. When so one of the things I run into a lot when digging into some of these companies is you find that they not only have like little offshoot, little subsidiary companies off to the side, they also have a lot of 501(c)(4)s like the Clinton Foundation and stuff
Mm,
like that, where they're, I mean, you can
mm.
look at like George Soros between his many corporate ventures as well as all the 501(c)(4)s that he's started up. Have you run into any 501(c)(4) organizations where they're collecting money, paying off politicians?
No, but I haven't really dug into that angle yet. So, I mean, I would definitely expect they would be involved in some of that sort of stuff. I'd be almost a little bit surprised if they didn't. Um, I will say it's interesting to me the way Bechtel has related to partisan politics, because for most of their existence as a company, they've been like Republican leaning, and the Bechtels themselves have tended to be Republicans. And not to say they've never done well under Democratic administrations. They have, but like they tend to do best, at least up till recently. It might be changing. Um, Although Trump seems to have a pretty positive relationship with the current patriarch of Bechtel, from what I can tell. But I will say that starting around 2008, if you go and look up political contributions, um, prior to 2008, it looks like Bechtel was pretty consistently almost always giving more money to Republicans than Democrats, excuse me.
Mhm.
But starting around 2008, it starts to swing the other way, and it's not 100%. There's still some election cycles where they give more to Republicans than Democrats, but since 2008, more often than not, at least in terms of federal level elections, they're giving
Okay.
off you there.
Yeah, it just kicked off for a second. That was weird. That was very strange. I'm
Hmm.
not getting a video on your side, but you were, or as of 2008 is where I lost you.
Yeah. So in the 2008 federal elections, the Bechtel gave more to Democrats than to Republicans. And I think in the majority of election cycles since then, including the midterms, the Bechtels have actually given more money to Democrats than Republicans, even though it seems like the current head of the family, and I forget his name off the top of my head, but the current head of the family seems to still be like personally Republican leaning. Um, and I think it partly is when you get to companies that level, they often are just opportunistic, and they'll fund both sides and they'll they'll fund more whichever party they kind of think is already going to win, I think. So, you can sort of see in like years where looking back on it like, yeah, the Democrats were favored, like '08, right? The Democrats were favored to win in '08 because of all the unpopularity of W. Bush and then the charisma of Obama and all that. And so, like, it makes sense that if you were just, because at the end of the day, the ideology of these people is money. That's, they might kind of lean certain ways on certain issues or whatever, but at the end of the day, it's like whatever is best for the bottom line is what they're going to do. And a really interesting example of this is, the Bechtels, they've always been till pretty recently, they've always been kind of, conservative, right-leaning, whatever. They loved Reagan, they loved Nixon, and they were like fiercely, pro Cold War, anti-communist, and yet they were always more than eager to do business with the communist world. So all the way back in the 1930s, the original founder of the dynasty, Warren Bechtel, was starting to do business with the Soviet Union and trying to like increase American business activity in the Soviet Union. And Warren Bechtel actually died, I think in Moscow or somewhere in the Soviet Union of a heart attack when he was visiting there on a business trip. And you find repeatedly throughout the Cold War, even while they're simultaneously like staunchly anti-communist, they're supporting people like Nixon or Reagan or Dulles who are like hardcore Cold Warriors, and yet they're happy to do business behind the Iron Curtain. Any chance they get, they care more about green than they do about red.
Yeah, and it's been a trend ever since the Clinton administration, and I think this is part of what Clinton brought to the Democratic Party, that the Democratic Party has become much more corporatist and
Oh yeah.
much more Wall Street oriented. And
Mm.
so it's not surprising to see someone like Bechtel flip from Republican to Democrat around that time frame,
Mm.
2008. It's been kind of like a slow progression. I did Google and I found there is a 501(c)(3). It's been operative since 1959, called Bechtel Group Foundation. So,
Mm.
um, I mean,
Yeah,
there's
I
not a
I know.
whole lot of information on here. It does say that have the revenue of 2023, total assets of 2023. It's kind of general stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in circling back to like their involvement amongst the California elite, I know one of the things they've always been super big into as far as quote unquote philanthropy is giving money to universities, especially a lot of the big prestigious California universities like UC Berkeley. They've given a lot to, as well as Stanford. And it's usually to like boost their engineering program. The Bechtels will donate to like build a new engineering
Mm,
building on the campus or whatever it is like that. So like if you go to a lot of these the bigger fancier universities in California, you'll find like buildings, Bechtel, such and such center, um, scholarships for engineering students and whatever like that. So yeah, it's another way to, exercise influence. Because obviously, if you're a big donor to a university, that gives you pull with them. And then also, their own self-interest of like, yeah, they want to, be able to recruit good engineers that'll, do a good job for the company, I guess. Interestingly, one of the things they've been involved in, and they're involved in so much stuff, but one of the things that Bechtel is involved in more recently is the so-called Big Dig in Boston, that giant boondoggle of a road building project. I don't even know if they're still doing that or if they finally just gave up on it or if they managed to get it done. But that was like an ongoing thing for like decades, right? People would joke about like the big dig in Boston that's just never going to end. Um, so it makes me think about like the larger point I've made in other places of when an empire is in decline, the overall quality of the people running it tends to decline. And
mm.
so here you've got Bechtel that like made its name as hell yeah, you got a giant impossible engineering project. Not only will we get it done, we'll get it done on or under budget. We'll get it done on time, if not early. Like, we got this, gung ho, get her done sort of a spirit. And it looks like in more recent decades that, some of their projects don't go quite as smoothly or get done quite as early and under budget and whatever. But it's just like another it's the same thing as like, the quality of the people the establishment keeps putting up to run for high offices and things is just like not impressive. Like even just setting aside ideology and whatever, just looking at them like, Kamala Harris or somebody like that, it's like
Mm.
this is not an impressive person. She doesn't even have the superficial skills of like lying slickly and being telegenic and smooth and charismatic. It's just like everything's just in decline right now from what I can tell.
Yeah, I think that's a interesting point because I mean, and it's kind of flipped because Jimmy Carter was not impressive by any stretch of the imagination. And then Reagan took the scene and he was an impressive guy. At least rhetorically, he was able to communicate and was impressive in that way. Um, H.W. Bush had interesting dynamic as far as his resume
Mm,
because of his involvement with the CIA
yeah,
prior to becoming vice president. Clinton was impressive, much like Reagan, very rhetorically and politically savvy and very rhetorically impressive. Um, then Bush Jr. was just a total imbecile, and Obama, for as far as I'm concerned, was probably the most impressive president of my lifetime, whether I agree with him or disagree with him on his politics. But and then since Obama, it's almost been like kind of revolutionary and like, hey, let's get just this somebody who talks like me in there, right?
yeah,
It's like the blue collar guys just like just give me somebody that's like me because I'm tired of these slick, political machines that are able to slide by me all these things that really screw me over. And
sure.
yeah, it's been kind of like downhill since Obama.
Yeah, I think part of that might just be the effect of like social media and podcasting and YouTube and all these sorts of things where authenticity now is like highly prized. And so Joe Rogan gets way more views than CNN. And the CNN people still talk like news robots. They still have like the news reporter voice and speak
Mm,
in those ridiculous, unrealistic ways. And like lots of average people, I think it just kind of are starting to see that for what it is. Like, oh yeah, this is just, BS. Whereas they listen to somebody like Joe Rogan or some other, popular podcaster or whatever, and just like, yeah, he sounds like a real dude. And I feel like he believes what he's saying, whether I agree with it or not. Like he believes what he's saying. Whereas with news people, um, you can kind of tell they're fake as soon as you hold it up against reality. You realize, like, oh, you can have someone telling you the news who talks more like how you talk, like a normal person.
mm.
And maybe that guy's more trustworthy because he's not doesn't seem like he's trying to pull one over on you in a way. Um, yeah, and hmm, yeah, with politics, I think there's people like Obama who are very good at the old school politics, like the politics paradigm, let's say from 1960, right, with the Nixon Kennedy debates when TV first, kind of became the centerpiece of American presidential politics. Um, Up until Obama's, election, his initial election, like TV was the dominant thing as far as media goes for everything, but including
Mm,
especially for presidential politics. And so we kind of got used to presidents who speak that way, who like give a good TV speech, like
mm,
all those old ones of like Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office. Well, my fellow Americans, let me tell you why I think SDI is a great idea. Um, and that way of talking, and then the sort of the stump speech way of talking too. And then yeah, you get into the social media, YouTube, podcasting era, and that kind of talking comes off as very like fake and off-putting. And I think it's part of why Obama doesn't have the magic he used to. I think partly it's that he's kind of losing it a little bit personally, but like yeah, the Obama's way of speaking that was so inspiring and electrifying to so many people 16 years ago. Well, that was '08. Like '08, social media was just really coming into being. It didn't
mm-hmm.
really play a major role in that election. I forget the exact year YouTube was started, but it was around then. Podcasting was started probably like in '07. So um, I feel like Obama might have a harder time as a candidate today, even if he was, in his prime, even if he was still like the age he was 16 years ago. I think he might have a harder time because I don't think he's as good at the new way of communicating. And I don't know. I think Trump is sort of like he might be what's the word I'm looking for? Like a transitionary figure, I guess,
Mm,
where where what comes after him is going to be communication style and strategies that are more applicable to the new kind of media environment. And Trump is this sort of like weird 1.0 version of that, of like I'm just going to be this guy who just rants off the cuff all the time and whatever. Um, and people find that refreshing because it's just so different from the you know can talking point way of talking. Let me tell you about my 5-point plan. Well, I just spoke to a teacher named Elizabeth in Ohio, in a city that happens to be in a swing county, and she told me that she can't buy cat food because her insulin's too expensive. Like all that phony crap is losing its force. The funny part to me is like if you look at Kamala Harris, she nothing. She does Obama or a Clinton or a Reagan, and she doesn't have the ability to connect and give people a feeling of authenticity that Trump does for, the
mm-hmm.
people that aren't totally TDS. A lot of them feel like, yeah, he's real, yeah, he's a little rough around the edges and, talk some shit or whatever, but like, he's real and he's telling it like it is, or at least like he thinks it is. And like Kamala Harris just has nothing. Like she's not good at any kind of communication. If she didn't have the entire propaganda apparatus of the establishment, behind her, she'd get nowhere.
All right. Well, you brought up Kamala Harris, which that's what your last podcast was kind of it focused on Bechtel, but it started off as I was investigating Kamala Harris and
Yeah.
look at this interesting tidbit I found about her. Do
Mm,
you think so? One of the things that I kind of think is happening in modern politics, especially since the advent of social media becoming so prominent in our lives, is it used to be easy for the intelligence community to propagandize the American people, and now it's so much more
mm,
difficult.
mm,
And I think Kamala Harris, like, probably would have worked in, let's say, 2004, 2008 timeframe, would have worked just fine. Works just fine on a senatorial level because the social media aspect that we pay so much attention to doesn't really pay that much attention to like House of Representatives or the Senate or any of these things. So I think on that level, she's just fine. But when you push that type of candidate who's so blatantly a sock puppet, like seriously,
right.
it's like she's not saying anything that she really means, and the reason she's not saying anything she really means is because they haven't adapted to the point of being able to portray that message of the deep states, let for lack of a better term, in a genuine, authentic, as you said, type of way, that it comes
Mm,
across very much, this is the company line, you're going to toe the company line, you're going to stay on the company line. And Trump gets that excitement going because he's so kind of off the cuff. It's hard to, I'm not saying Trump doesn't have donors and he doesn't have people that he doesn't listen to, because I mean, we all know there are people out there that are kind of in Trump's ear, and he's pretty easy to sway one way or the other from all the stories that we've heard. But
mm,
it's not like he's acting on behalf of some larger entity, whereas it feels like Kamala Harris is acting on behalf of this larger entity. And I'm
mm.
wondering if that doesn't tie back to that Bechtel um, kind of ensnaring her at a very early age.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we don't have a great grasp on the way that the way that different institutions and things sort of groom people. And I feel like there's a whole bunch of current high level political leaders, including like recent former presidents and whatever, where when you look at their background, you can find like these little breadcrumbs where you're like, oh, they're being sort of vetted or they're being sort of groomed, and they may not always even be aware that that's happening.
Mm,
So yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, the fact that Kamala Harris spent a lot of her youth at a youth center in Berkeley that was likely CIA funded and was 1 degree of separation from the Bechtel Corporation. Um, not necessarily that someone at the time in like the 70s when Kamala was 10 years old or something was sitting there going, one day she's going to be a senator and vice president, and let's go ahead and, but more that as she comes up, like that's the milieu she's in. And then she
mm,
goes from there to like certain educational institutions, and she goes from there to certain jobs and things. And it's like this almost like autopilot grooming process in a lot of ways. And same thing when you look into the background of someone like Obama and you look at like, oh, where did he go to school? Who did he rub elbows with when he was at Harvard? What extracurricular things did he do? Who else was in those and you can just and very often you find these little hallmarks of intelligence, like I did with Kamala Harris, where another example is like Bill Clinton. Here's this Arkansas redneck born to a single mom. Oh, he can never be a member of the power elite or whatever. Well, he can't be an owner, but he could be a pretty high up manager if he follows the right path and plays his cards right. And so, it's things like, oh, he got a Rhodes Scholarship. Bing, bing, bing. There's a little red flag. There's an establishment grooming
Mm,
mechanism if ever there was one, or in the case of somebody else, it might be like, oh, they were the first in their family to ever go to Yale, and holy crap, for whatever reason, some of the Skull and Bones men saw something in this guy. Saw, oh, here's a talented, charismatic dude who, they may have no idea whether he'll ever get into politics or whatever, but they're like, oh, this is a really like charming, charismatic, well-spoken guy. He's going somewhere, whether he's going to be a corporate CEO one day or a big Hollywood star, or whether he's going to be a president. We might not even be sure, but he's going places. And so, you know what? Even though he's not a legacy, let's go ahead and recruit him into Skull and Bones, and then like as you work your way up, then you have those things on your sort of like invisible ink resume, for lack of a better term, where it's like, if you're getting ready to run for president and someone high up connected to the CIA, part of the permanent sort of deep state bureaucracy of it, is looking at like, oh, do we really want Senator Billy Bob to be president? And they're like, well, look, he was in this club when he was at Yale. Look, he went to this, he was a member of the board of this company while he was a congressman. He was, and can just sort of say like he's one of us. Like he's part of our club, he may not even realize that's what he is, but he is. And so, Obama fits that. Bill Clinton fits that. Um, Kamala Harris fits that. Trump really doesn't. And yeah, as much as like I wish he was as anti-establishment as the establishment thinks he is, but yeah, they look at him and they see someone who's not part of the club. They see someone who is, in terms of the political realm, still like an outsider and someone they can't trust. And that's, I think, what it comes down to. And the fact that like the CIA knew they could trust Bill Clinton, and they were fine with either H.W. Bush or Clinton winning in '92, I think. Because H.W. Bush, like you mentioned earlier, CIA guy, even was head of the CIA for a while and was probably an off the books agent for decades before that, as Ruth Baker shows, I think, pretty convincingly in Family of Secrets. But then Bill Clinton, oh, he was a Rhodes Scholar. He was taught by Carol Quigley when he was at Georgetown. Like he has all this other like
hmm.
conspiracy world sort of credentials. And when he was governor of Arkansas, he collaborated with the CIA in the drug running operations that were running drugs into Mena, Arkansas. That's the whole thing that Barry Seal was involved with and all those guys. And Clinton's role as governor of Arkansas in like the 80s was, one of his jobs was to basically make sure that no law enforcement ever went out and messed around with Barry Seal's little airport there, where the CIA was running coke in and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And
Yep.
so they knew that they could trust him because he had done a fine job of keeping the CIA's drug running operation in Arkansas running. And then on top of that, a lot of these people, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them are also, very compromised. They're very blackmailable, right? Because it's you can bribe someone up until a certain point. Once they're rich enough, bribery doesn't hold quite the power that it used to. And in that case, if you want to manipulate them, you go from bribery to blackmail.
One thing I noticed that of all the names you're mentioning, and that's completely different than Kamala Harris is like whether it be Reagan or Bush, junior or senior, really, Clinton, Obama, Trump, Biden, they're all charismatic. Like
Hmm.
like the Democrats keep trying to push this whole woman issue down our throat with like Hillary and Kamala, and they're not charismatic at all,
Yep.
right? I mean, if they were to like push like AOC, I'd be like, she's charismatic. That's a charismatic
Right.
woman. Like she could be dangerous, right?
Hmm.
But they're pushing these kind of I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. These unlikable women down our throats. Like
Yeah.
and it's really strange. But I do wonder Willie Brown if Willie Brown has any links to Bechtel, being he was a lifelong politician in San
Hmm.
Francisco area in California. What his relationship to Bechtel would be because um I don't know if you saw it, but Tucker Carlson did an interview with Harmeet Dillon a couple of weeks ago,
Hmm.
and she was talking about Kamala Harris's background, and that Kamala Harris didn't even register to vote until she was 29 years old after she was already dating Willie Brown. And that
Hmm.
seems to be when the trajectory of her life went into the political direction. That everything that occurred prior to her dating Willie Brown was didn't seem like she was heading in the direction of politics at all.
So she was just going to be some sort of a lawyer, but
Right.
not ever run for office. That's interesting.
Yeah, she
Yeah,
had
I
worked. I
haven't.
think she had worked at a for the district attorney prosecuting criminals, but that was pretty much the extent of it. And I think
Mhm.
prior to meeting Willie Brown, she'd only, from what Harmeet Dillon had said, she'd only tried like 7 cases prior to turning 30 years old.
Hmm.
So she wasn't
Interesting.
extremely active.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, that's a phase of her life and career I haven't really looked at much. Um, but I'm sure there's a lot there to dig up and probably a lot of things that we'll never know. But yeah, I mean, I think most high level politicians in California are going to have some sort of contact and relationship with Bechtel. Not to say that they all are, super tight with Bechtel, but it's just one of those powerful, interests in the state. In the same way that it's hard, here in my home state of Florida, it's hard to find a high level Florida politician who's not got something in their background having to do with development.
Hmm.
So, most of our governors for like the last, I don't even know, at least the last 70, 80 years, almost all of them in their background before running for governor is at least some activity like being a lawyer for a development corporation or whatever like that. Um, and to a somewhat lesser extent, but still to a pretty big extent, usually there's at least some contact with and support from the sugar lobbies as well.
Hmm.
Um, and sometimes from Disney. Like every state, especially if it's a bigger state in population, like Florida, California, I would assume Texas, there's always like a handful of big corporate interests that like you've got to either be buddies with or at least work out some sort of an arrangement with if you want to have a good chance of getting elected to any significant office, whether it's governor or senator or whatever like that. Um, I think I remember hearing somewhere, and I didn't dig into it too much, but that like one thing that was different about Ron DeSantis getting elected governor of Florida, whenever it was 6, 7 years ago,
Hmm.
um, is that I think he actually had like not gotten any significant support from it and even sort of gone against the sugar lobby. And and same thing with Disney that like he didn't like owe Disney any favors or have any relationship with them or whatever. And so, it allows a politician to then come in and kind of do his own thing. Which you can get away with at the state level a lot of the time, but as soon as you come in and start trying to really do your own thing at the federal level, then that's when they'll usually start with lower level options. They'll try and just take you out in the next primary by sponsoring your challenger. They'll try and trick you into doing something stupid so there's a scandal or try and manufacture a scandal. And if it's important enough and you keep dodging all their stuff and actually have a realistic possibility of being a threat, well, they might just have a deranged lone nut with no coherent political ideology try and shoot you. Ron Paul could get away with telling the truth and being radical and whatever because he was an obscure congressman who like didn't get very many committee appointments because he didn't play ball with the party,
I
and
don't
so they
know.
just
They put out a list when Ron Paul was running. I remember this specifically because I remember Glenn Beck talking about it. But I don't remember if it was the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Justice said that if you saw somebody with a Ron Paul sticker on their car, you're possibly dealing with a domestic terrorist.
yeah, no, I remember that. I used to have photo copies and it was I think that stuff amped up when he was running for president and actually starting to get some attention. I was talking more about like when he was just a congressman and and like okay fine talk to nobody on
Yeah.
C-SPAN whatever we'll just ignore you. But yeah, definitely when he ran for president and actually started to get some traction and whatever, they did what they could to marginalize him. But
One of the things I
yeah, yeah.
just looked at, sorry, one of the things I was just looking at because I was just curious was you said that Bechtel kind of turned into the Democratic Party in 2008, which was when Obama was elected. And
Mm,
that's also 3 years before Schwarzenegger was no longer the California governor, and California elected a Democratic governor after that,
mm.
which is just interesting. I mean,
Yeah,
it could be
yeah.
nothing, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess that would be like around the time that California just completely became a one party
mm,
state, right?
right.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe it. Like Reagan won California twice running for governor and twice running for president.
Hmm.
Um, like can't imagine that happening today. So yeah, maybe partly, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe that's part of the explanation too, is just that with the Democrats becoming so overwhelmingly dominant within the state, they're like, all right, well, we got to play ball with them, and
Hmm.
we better give them, even though they might not be our first preferential choice. We need to start giving them boatloads of money. That way, when they do come into power, we've got some traction with them. Because if we haven't given them any money, then we have no pull, right? So, just a classic investment to buy influence.
Well, all right, man. Well, you said you had a hard out at 8, and we're at 7:57, and I don't want to keep you any longer. I always try to get people out on time. So plug everything you got to
Appreciate
plug.
that. Sure. So, dangeroushistorypodcast.com is the website, and you can search for Dangerous History Podcast wherever you want to consume your podcasts. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the usual suspects. You'll find it there. I've been doing this podcast for over 10 years at this point. I've covered lots of stuff. Lots of my stuff is no longer available in the public feed, though. Lots of my stuff. So hundreds of episodes of old stuff and all kinds of other goodies waiting at patreon.com/PROFCJ. That's patreon.com/PROFCJ. Help support me, keep me doing what I'm doing, and also get yourself a whole bunch of additional material and bonuses and goodies.
Good deal, dude. I really appreciate it. I'm going to stop the recording.